The lights dim, the world falls silent, and the question lingers like a dagger in the dark. Can love really bend the laws of life and death? When money fails, when doctors surrender, when power no longer holds sway, what remains? In this story, the answer is something that no empire of steel, no fortune of billions, no name carved in marble could ever purchase. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought in boardrooms or stock exchanges, but in the quiet shadows of a hospital room where a child fights to breathe and someone without a drop of shared DNA decides to risk everything for her. This is the story of Sebastien, the CEO with riches that could buy half the city, and Carmen, the woman the world called a servant, but who became something greater, something no contract or paycheck could ever define. And it begins with a girl named Laura, only 6 years old, already staring at death in the eyes. Laura was the only daughter of Sebastien, a multimillionaire who had built his empire from the ground up. His name was synonymous with power in snow polo. He sat on boards, negotiated international deals, and had his face on magazine covers that celebrated the titans of industry. To the outside world, he was the man who had everything private jets, a mansion in Morimby that spread across an entire block, rare art hanging on his walls, an empire of glass and steel that bent the city skyline to his will. Yet inside those walls, away from the cameras and champagne, Sebastien carried a secret wound. His wife had died giving birth to Laura, leaving him with a newborn in his arms and a mansion that echoed with silence. He poured himself into work, into numbers and expansions, into mergers that distracted him from the gnawing ache inside. But the one thing that truly gave his life meaning was the fragile, beautiful girl who called him Papai. Laura had inherited her mother's eyes, wide and full of light, but behind them now was a shadow. At just 6 years old, her body was failing her. It began quietly. Fatigue, fevers, small complaints that any parent might dismiss as seasonal. Sebastien thought it was nothing, a flu perhaps. But as the days turned into weeks, as the child who once danced barefoot in the garden now lay exhausted in bed, he ordered the finest doctors money could hire. They came from Europe, from the United States, from the best clinics in Brazil. They ran tests in the sterile corridors of Vicerio Labada's hospital, tests that returned with a sentence no wealth could erase. Laura had a rare, aggressive cancer. The words shattered Sebastien. In boardrooms, he was a lion. Nothing intimidated him. But here, in the face of an invisible enemy growing inside his daughter's body, he was powerless. Still, he refused to yield. He spent millions chasing every treatment that offered even a whisper of hope. Chemotherapy, immunotherapy, experimental drugs smuggled in under special clearance. Clinical trials abroad, nothing worked. Each attempt began with a flicker of hope, only to end with Laura weaker, paler, thinner. The mansion became an extension of the hospital, filled with nurses and equipment. But Sebastien's heart was trapped in a cage of helplessness. And then there was Carmen. She had been in the house since the beginning, hired as a cleaner after Sebastien's wife died, but she had become much more. While Sebastien worked late nights, Carmen was the one who rocked Laura to sleep, who dried her tears, who tied her shoelaces in the morning, and whispered silly stories in the dark to chase away nightmares. The staff changed, nurses rotated, but Carmen remained. The girl had given her a name, Mammy Number 2, a title that was never asked for, never claimed, but freely given out of pure trust. For Carmen, this bond was more than work. She had once lost her own sister to illness as a child, a pain that had etched itself permanently in her heart. She had vowed silently that if ever another child came under her care, she would not allow them to feel abandoned in their fight. And now she was keeping that promise with every lullaby, every meal, every smile she forced through her own tears. The doctor's verdict was merciless. 3 months, they said. Maybe less. Sebastien heard those words and felt the floor fall beneath him. His empire meant nothing if he couldn't save his daughter. He spent nights at her bedside, reading stories in a voice that cracked with grief, watching cartoons on a tablet while hiding his tears in the shadows. Lavra, wise beyond her years, never complained. She only asked for one thing, a birthday party. Balloons, cake, music, friends. She wanted to wear a pink dress and dance. It was the kind of request that broke a father's heart, because it came not from innocence, but from a child who knew she might not live to see another one. The mansion filled with children's laughter on that day, balloons tied to chandeliers worth more than some houses, a cake big enough for a wedding, a garden lit with fairy lights. But beneath the glitter, the truth clung to every corner. Lavra, bald from treatments, smiled brighter than ever, but her small body trembled with fatigue. Sebastien watched from a distance, clapping, forcing smiles, while inside he was breaking. Carmen, dressed simply as always, stood by Laura's side, feeding her spoonfuls of cake, adjusting her dress, laughing with her as though the world wasn't collapsing. And then, in the middle of it all, Laura looked at Carmen with those piercing child's eyes and whispered the question that stopped time. Will I live, Mommy? Not Mammy number 2. Not Carmen. Just Mommy. The room froze. The music seemed to vanish. Sebastien, standing by the door, felt the words cut through him like glass. Carmen's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to tell her yes, that everything would be fine, but her heart would not allow it. She only held the girl's small hand tighter, whispering, You are strong, Minafila. I am here with you. She didn't say yes, didn't say no, just the truth of her presence. Sebastien turned away, covering his face with his hands, unable to bear the weight of that moment. That night, Carmen could not sleep. Laura's question echoed endlessly in her mind. Will I live, Mommy? She knew she had to do something, even if it meant breaking every rule, crossing every line. She began searching through medical journals, forums, hospital websites. Her old laptop flickered with endless tabs of hope and despair. And then she found it, a living donor liver transplant. A risky procedure requiring perfect compatibility, usually performed between family members. Carmen knew she wasn't family, not in the legal sense, not in blood. But in her heart she was. The next morning, without telling anyone, Carmen went to a clinic and had herself tested. Days later, an envelope arrived. Inside it were results that seemed to defy reason itself. She was a match. Not partial, not approximate, but perfect. Blood type, enzymes, tissue markers, everything aligned as though fate itself had written it. It was so rare it bordered on impossible. Carmen's hands shook as she read, tears blurring the words. For her, it was not science, it was destiny. But destiny has enemies. When Carmen approached the hospital, offering herself as a donor, the doctors refused. Policies, they said. Laws, they said. She was not a legal guardian, not a relative. Even if she was a match, they could not proceed. Carmen begged, explained, cried. She told them how Laura called her mommy, how she had raised her, how love could not be measured in paperwork. But the answer was still no. Sebastien, when he found out, was furious. Not because he didn't see Carmen's love, but because he feared losing her too. He told her never to speak of it again. But Carmen had already decided. If Brazil would not allow it, she would find someone who would. She searched again, deeper this time, across borders, across continents. And then, in a hospital abroad, she found Dr. Morales, a man who had lost his own daughter to liver disease, and who now dedicated his life to saving others. When he read Carmen's plea, he saw not just a desperate nanny, but a mother willing to risk everything. He agreed. Quietly, secretly, against the tide of bureaucracy, he said yes. Carmen arranged everything while Sebastien traveled on business, thinking the fight was over. With forged documents, with whispered help from sympathetic nurses, she boarded a plane with Laura, holding her hand, telling her they were going somewhere special where people could help. Laura, too weak to question, trusted her completely. The hospital abroad was ready. Tests confirmed what the papers had said. Carmen was the perfect donor. The surgery was scheduled. That night, Carmen sat by Laura's bed and wrote a letter, placing it beneath her pillow. "If I don't wake up," it said, "know that Mommy said yes." The next morning, under cold white lights, 2 operating rooms waited. One for the child who clung to life, the other for the woman who had no blood ties, but a bond stronger than any. As the anesthetic took her under, Carmen whispered a final prayer, not for herself, but for Laura. And somewhere thousands of kilometers away, Sebastien's phone rang. Sebastien had just finished a meeting in New York, a boardroom of polished mahogany, and men in tailored suits who hung on his every word, when his phone buzzed with a foreign number. He almost ignored it, but something inside told him to pick up. On the other end, a calm but firm voice spoke. "Your daughter is currently in surgery." At first, he thought it was a mistake. "What surgery? What hospital?" the voice explained. "A liver transplant. Overseas. Carmen had brought her." Carmen was on the operating table as well. The name hit him like a thunderclap. Carmen, the woman he had told not to do anything reckless. The woman who had quietly raised his daughter while he fought wars in boardrooms. The woman who had defied him. His chair fell backward as he stood, his face drained of blood. The executive stared in confusion, but Sebastien didn't explain. He stormed out, his phone pressed to his ear, demanding details, his voice shaking for the first time in years. He booked the first flight, money no object, power meaningless. The jet engines roared into the night sky, but for him, time moved unbearably slow. In the sterile silence of the hospital abroad, 2 battles were being fought. Carmen's body lay under bright lights as surgeons carefully removed a section of her liver, their hands steady, but the risk enormous. A living donor operation was no simple thing. Her blood was monitored, her vitals dipped and rose. Just across the hall, Laura's small body was opened with equal care, the cancerous tissue removed, the fragile hope of life prepared to accept the gift of flesh and blood Carmen was offering. The clock was merciless. Every second counted. Dr. Morale stood over both procedures, his eyes sharp, his mind haunted by memories of his own daughter he had lost years before. He saw Carmen's face pale under anesthesia, her breathing steady under machines, and he felt the weight of destiny pressing on him. This was not just medicine. This was redemption. Hours passed like minutes. Outside, the night deepened. Sebastien's plane cut through clouds, but he was powerless, a king without a sword, a billionaire without control. His hands shook as he held Laura's stuffed rabbit, the one she never slept without, that Carmen must have packed in her small suitcase. He thought of the mornings Carmen braided Laura's hair, of the laughter he sometimes overheard echoing through the mansion, laughter he himself had not been able to bring. When his plane touched down, he ran through the airport like a man chased by ghosts, ignoring the eyes of strangers who whispered, "Isn't that Sebastien?" He didn't care. He pushed past customs, hailed a taxi, and threw a stack of bills at the driver, demanding the hospital's address. Inside, the surgery was still ongoing. Nurses moved swiftly, their voices hushed. The air was thick with urgency. Then, finally, the first success. Carmen's liver section, flushed and ready, was carried to Laura's room. The transplant began, precise and delicate, a dance between death and rebirth. Hours later, the final sutures were tied. Machines beeped steadily. For now, both were alive. When Sebastian burst into the intensive care unit, what he saw broke him. 2 beds, 2 bodies. His daughter, tiny and fragile, her hand wrapped in gauze, sleeping under the glow of machines. And Carmen, pale, still unconscious, her chest rising and falling shallowly, her face drained but peaceful. For the first time in his life, Sebastian wept without shame. The tears poured down, not in silence, not hidden, but openly, like a man who had finally understood what true strength looked like. It wasn't in skyscrapers or luxury cars. It wasn't in contracts signed with fountain pens worth fortunes. It was in a woman who had nothing but gave everything. A nurse quietly handed him an envelope, Carmen's letter. He opened it with trembling hands. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." The words hit him harder than any deal lost, any empire threatened. He sank to his knees beside her bed, clutching the letter, whispering words he had never spoken to her. "Thank you. Forgive me. Please wake up." Days turned into a blur. Laura's body began to accept the new liver. Her vitals stabilized. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. Sebastian sat by her side, reading stories with a voice heavy but hopeful, watching as her chest rose more easily each day. And Carmen, she remained unconscious. Doctors said it was not uncommon after such a major procedure, but Sebastian's fear grew heavier with each passing hour. He found himself dividing his time between the 2 beds, holding Laura's small hand with one and Carmen's calloused, worn hand with the other. He remembered every moment Carmen had been there for Laura, every time she filled the void he himself had left. He realized he had underestimated her. He had thought of her as an employee, someone hired to clean, to help. But she had been a mother all along, giving what money could not buy. One evening, as the city outside glowed with lights Carmen would never see, Lavra stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, groggy, but alive. She whispered weakly, "Where's Mommy?" Sebastian's throat tightened. He glanced at Carmen, still motionless. He leaned down to Laura, kissing her forehead. "She's right here. She never left you." The next morning, a miracle happened. Carmen's fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. Sebastian was there instantly, his hand on hers. When she finally focused, the first word she whispered was not about herself. "Lavra? She's alive," Sebastian said, his voice breaking. "Because of you." Tears spilled down Carmen's cheeks. She tried to speak, but he stopped her, shaking his head. "Don't. Just rest. You've done enough. More than anyone." Weeks passed. The recovery was long, fragile, uncertain, but both Lavra and Carmen grew stronger. Sebastian never left their sides. The man who once measured his life in profits and losses now counted it in heartbeats and smiles. He canceled meetings, postponed mergers, let the empire run itself. For the first time, he was simply a father. When they finally returned to Brazil, the world found out. The story could not be contained. A billionaire's daughter saved not by science, not by fortune, but by the sacrifice of a woman the world had dismissed as the help. Headlines exploded. Journalists camped outside the mansion gates. Some called it a miracle, others a scandal. How could a man with everything fail to save his daughter until his nanny risked her life? But Sebastian no longer cared for reputation. He faced the cameras once, standing beside Carmen, his daughter in her wheelchair, smiling between them, and said simply, "This woman is not my employee. She is my family. She is my daughter's mother. And she is the bravest person I have ever known." The world gasped, but Sebastian's empire did not crumble. Instead, it transformed. Investors respected him more, seeing not just a titan of steel, but a man who understood sacrifice. Employees whispered that their boss had changed, that he smiled more, and he looked them in the eye. In the mansion, the echoes of silence were replaced once again with laughter. Laura's laughter, Carmen's laughter, even Sebastiou's laughter, rough and unpracticed, but real. The halls that once felt like mausoleums now felt like home. Carmen never asked for recognition. She never wanted headlines or gratitude. All she wanted was to see Lavra live, to see her grow, to keep her promise to a sister lost long ago. And she did. She gave a part of herself, literally, to keep another alive. And Sebastiou, the man who once believed money could solve anything, learned the hardest truth. Love cannot be bought. It can only be given, freely, at great cost. Years later, when Lavra walked into her graduation wearing a bright pink dress, her hair grown back, her cheeks glowing with health, Carmen stood in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her face. Sebastiou stood beside her, proud, humbled, transformed. And when Lavra took the stage, she didn't thank doctors, or money, or fate. She looked at Carmen and said, "Thank you, Mommy, for giving me my life twice." The applause roared, but for Carmen, the sound that mattered was not the crowd, but the steady heartbeat of the girl she had saved. Because in the end, love had done what fortune could not. It had rewritten the rules, defied death, and proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world overlooks. And Sebastiou knew, for the rest of his life, that the truest empire he had ever built was not his company, not his wealth, but the family forged by sacrifice and love inside the walls of his once empty mansion. The question lingers still. Can an act of love challenge death and rewrite the rules? The answer lives in the story of a billionaire, his daughter, and the woman who proved that to be a mother requires no DNA, only unimaginable courage.